Welcome to this third video involving the converse of results about transversals. In this video, we're going to look at how we can set up some valid equations involving specific angles in a figure. We're going to look at a total of 3 examples from the notes. The first one is currently pictured on the screen. Now, I would recommend color coding for these if it's helpful for you, but one way or another, please visually mark what's happening on the figure so that it's easier to stay organized with what the equations could be. For example, in this problem, we know that lines M and N are parallel. Just in order to be able to work with that, let's highlight those items on the picture in front of us. Now, let's also indicate which angles we are working with. In order to do that, we will point out that we have angle 2, angle 3, angle 5, and angle 12 with which we need to form equations. Now in this setup, the easiest way to form equations is to specifically isolate one transversal at a time. For instance, let's focus on transversal P initially. If we needed to write out 2 valid equations regarding these 4 angles, one of which will be formed by the 2 angles based at transversal P, specifically angles 5 and 12. Now angles 5 and 12 are formed by parallel lines, and angles 5 and 12 are an alternate interior angle pair. Oh, excuse me. Now, as we focus on transversal P, the 2 angles in play are angles 5 and 12. Angles 5 and 12 are alternate exterior angles formed by parallel lines, and alternate exterior angles are congruent when the lines are parallel. So our equation for the 2 angles involved at transversal P would be that the measure of angle 5 is equal to the measure of angle 12. That's all we need to see. If we were asked to set up 2 legitimate equations involving this picture, the measure of angle 5 equals the measure of angle 12. I want and need to see that equation, and I also want and need to see which transversal was used to get that equation. So the other transversal that we can look at in this picture is transversal Q. Again, if we were writing up work for a quiz, an assignment, a test, we would specifically note that we are looking at transversal Q. And in this case, the 2 angles involved are angles 2 and 3. Well, angles 2 and 3 are corresponding angles, and they're formed by parallel lines, M and N. And we know that corresponding angles are congruent when the lines are parallel. So our equation here would be that the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 3. Those are the only 2 legitimate equations we can form using some combination of angles 2, 3, 5, and 12 in this specific picture. This would be all we would look for if it were a problem just like this on a quiz, assignment, or test. Specify the transversal and indicate the equation. Let's move to our second example. Well, this example looks eerily similar to the previous example, but there's one small difference. This time, we're looking at P and Q as the parallel lines, whereas last time, M and N were the parallel lines. So let's indicate that lines P and Q are parallel now. And after indicating that lines P and Q are parallel, let's indicate the angles in the picture with which we are working. We have angles 2, 3, 5, and 12. Now we need to form any legitimate equation that we can get in this picture. In order to do that, we just look one transversal at a time. So let's begin by looking at transversal M. please specifically write it out on any quiz, assignment, or test that we are considering transversal M. The two angles involved with transversal M in this setup are angles 5 and 2. They are same side interior angles formed by parallel lines. And from our earlier result, we said that if the lines are parallel, then the same side interior angle pairs are supplementary. What we would have here is that the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 5 would equal 180 degrees. But we also have transversal N. So when we focus in on transversal N, there are two angles that are in play. Please again specify that we're looking at transversal N. The two angles are angles 3 and 12. What type of special angle pair are angles 3 and 12? Trick question. We didn't give that particular pair of angles a specific name. So sometimes we have to look at the picture just a little bit more carefully in order to determine the result. In this case, angle 12 would be congruent to angle 10 because those two angles are corresponding angles formed by parallel lines. But then angles 10 and 3 would add up to be 180 degrees because they're a linear pair. Well, now since angles 12 and 10 are the same, angle 10 is essentially the same as angle 12, so our result would be that the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 12 is equal to 180 degrees. That's all the work we would need to see on a quiz, an assignment, or a test. Simply indicate what the transversal is and what the related equation would be. I highly encourage visually marking the picture, one way or another. Students who stay visually organized in the picture tend to form correct equations much more frequently than those who don't mark the picture with any visual notations. Let's look at one more example from the notes in this video. That third example is currently pictured on the screen. You are welcome to press the pause button on this video if you want to try to solve this problem before we discuss it together. Okay, so a similar situation here. We have that lines M and N are parallel. Even if you're not big with highlighters and coloring a picture, please do something on the picture to visually remind yourself that those are the parallel lines. Additionally, let's indicate which angles we're working with. In this case, we have angles 1, 15, 13, and 7. Now, let's take each potential transversal one at a time. In this case, the first potential transversal is transversal P. On any quiz, assignment, or test, that's essentially the work that I need to see. Specify the transversal. Now, when we look at transversal P, the two relevant angles are angles 1 and 13. Those angles are alternate exterior angles. And alternate exterior angles are congruent, or more specifically, they are equal in measure when formed by parallel lines. And then we have one more potential transversal in this picture. That would be transversal Q. And when we look at transversal Q in this picture, the two angles are 7 and 15. Now keep in mind here, those are not a special named angle pair that we've discussed. However, angle 7 and angle 5 will be congruent because those two angles are corresponding angles formed by parallel lines. So angle 7 is really the same as angle 5. And since angles 5 and 15 form a straight line, we will be able to come up with the fact that the measure of angle 7 plus the measure of angle 15 is equal to 180 degrees. Now, sometimes I stress one other way that we can come up with equations, and it works for some people but not for everyone. So let's come back to our blue transversal, P. First of all, we know that vertical angles are congruent. I'm going to mark them with X's. Additionally, we know that corresponding angles are congruent when the lines are parallel, and the vertical angle would have to be congruent as well. So those four angles that are denoted with an X all have to be congruent. Well, the other angles, we can kind of play a tic-tac-toe game here to some extent. Let's denote those with O's. The four angles with X's have to be congruent because the lines are parallel, and the four angles with O's have to be congruent because the lines are parallel. If the particular angles that we're looking at are formed by the same letter, in this case, angles 1 and 13 are both X's, they would have to be equal in measure. On the other hand, let's now look at the right-hand side of this picture. So if we're focusing on the right-hand side of this picture, we'll play the same game. Vertical angles we'll place with X's here, and as long as those are the corresponding angles, like 8 and 6, let's place those with X's as well. The other angles we'll fill in with O's, essentially develop a tic-tac-toe board. When the angles have different letters, in this case angle 7 has an O and angle 15 has an X, that's when those angles are supplementary and their measures add up to 180 degrees. Whatever works for you to identify whether the angles are going to be equal in measure or add up to 180 degrees in measure is fine. The things that I need to see for sure are what is the transversal and what is the equation. What is the transversal and what is the equation? And ideally, you've done something to the picture to help yourself be visually organized in forming those equations.